The Cuban Missile Crisis. For anyone who thinks recent U.S. history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s. Extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Welcome to Explained Simply channel, where complex topics become crystal clear and easy to understand. Let's start the second part of the Cold War story. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, Fidel Castro met with Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City. The two revolutionaries decided they would overthrow the Cuban government, and that's exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the U.S. immediately began training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, President Kennedy wanted to conceal any U.S. involvement in the plan. So he massively scaled back American air support. And as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. Castro felt there was still an impending U.S. threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Premier Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America. But they could if they were positioned on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Castro and Khrushchev, both opposing America, found common cause. The Soviets would place their missiles in Cuba. On October 14, 1962, a U.S. spy plane over Cuba noticed something alarming. Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed just 90 miles from American shores. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. Kennedy knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So he came up with another idea, a naval blockade. The U.S. Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviets put their military into full combat readiness. The U.S. did the same and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. For the first time in history, the U.S. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer refused to authorize the decision, preventing what could have been the start of World War III. The U.S. finalized its preparations for invasion. But at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if America removed its missiles from Turkey. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief. The Vietnam War. Having nearly destroyed the planet, a few changes were made. The superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. The Soviets replaced Khrushchev with Leonid Brezhnev. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect of nuclear war, but still the arms race raged on throughout the 1960s and 1970s. After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 1950s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out, and the country was divided into two. In the north, a communist government led by Ho Chi Minh. In the south, an anti-communist government led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Both leaders had their own vision for Vietnam's future, and both dreamed of reuniting the country under their respective systems. The North established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the South with Soviet support. The U.S. sent military advisors to help train the South Vietnamese army to deal with the threat, but President Diem's harsh policies pushed more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong. Over the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. If South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? President Johnson had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops. And so in 1965, American combat forces arrived in Vietnam. America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before. Millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight an enemy who used the thick jungle as their shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was or who they were. The civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a massive bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. It was a long and brutal war. In terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive. Their ideological battle shifted away from direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the U.S. backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw U.S.-supported forces fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. The U.S. continued fighting the spread of communism in Latin America, funding groups to fight socialist governments in Nicaragua and elsewhere. Back in Vietnam, the human suffering was being broadcast back home via television. Going into the late 1960s, America was a changing nation. The counterculture movement grew stronger. The new slogan taking root was "Make love, not war." The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War. In 1968, a silent majority elected Richard Nixon on a law and order platform. As the Vietnam War appeared increasingly unwinnable and public opinion turned increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home. The U.S. ended its involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, in 1975, South Vietnam fell to the north, and the country was reunified under communist rule. Détente and Reagan. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers. In the Soviet Union, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. The Soviet people didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. Both sides needed to reduce spending to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow in 1972. Brezhnev returned the favor a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving through ping-pong diplomacy when the U.S. table tennis team toured the People's Republic. Nixon visited China in 1972, marking a historic thaw in relations. Everything was going well for Nixon until it was uncovered that he had violated constitutional protocol in the Watergate scandal. Nixon resigned in 1974, and Vice President Gerald Ford took over. Ford's first act as president was to pardon Nixon, which damaged public trust in government. After the scandal, Americans elected Jimmy Carter, who promised honest leadership. Carter and Brezhnev met in Vienna, where they signed another strategic arms limitation treaty. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was plenty of it. The Soviet Union continued to suppress reform attempts in Eastern Europe. The Euro Missile Crisis saw new classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to support a communist government against Islamic insurgents, beginning their own costly conflict that would last a decade. In response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted by both sides. American conservatives were concerned that U.S. policy had become too soft on communism. In 1980, they elected Ronald Reagan, who promised to be tough on the Soviet Union. Reagan came in with aggressive rhetoric. Concerned at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire. Reagan wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances. He proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a defensive anti-missile shield around the country. The Soviet leadership perceived this shift in American policy as preparation for war, and they felt especially threatened as their relationship with China had deteriorated. Relations took a major hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, killing all 269 passengers aboard. It looked like the world was going right back to mid-century Cold War tensions. But then Soviet leadership began to change. Brezhnev died and was replaced by Yuri Andropov, who died shortly after. He was replaced by Konstantin Chernenko, who also died soon after. Finally, in 1985, a younger leader emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was the real game changer. The collapse of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's philosophy differed significantly from previous Soviet leaders. He believed that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, and unlike previous leaders, he actually made change happen. Within his first couple of years, Gorbachev began a political movement called Glasnost, meaning openness and transparency, and perestroika, the restructuring of Soviet political and economic systems. Change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, and the media became more open. The Soviet people could now access goods and services previously unavailable to them. Gorbachev also knew that the arms race needed to end to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which eliminated all intermediate-range missiles. This was a massive breakthrough. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften considerably. But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades, the Soviets had been brutally repressing any attempt at change. Would reform now be allowed? That was the exact question on Hungary's mind when their prime minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response was historic. He wouldn't necessarily agree with all reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive news. Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections. Poland followed suit and held elections in June 1989. The anti-Soviet Solidarity Party won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling. But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. East Germany was still ruled by hardline communist Erich Honecker. Many East Germans were eager to escape. That summer, East Germans traveled to Hungary in droves, and using various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker blocked travel to Hungary, but the movement for civil liberties couldn't be stopped. Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague. Mass protests erupted in East Germany, growing larger each day. The East German leadership realized this movement was bigger than them. The entire Politburo voted Honecker out of power. On November 9, 1989, in a chaotic announcement, the East German government lifted the travel ban between East and West. That night, huge crowds gathered at the Berlin Wall crossing points. The guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation, people were allowed to pass through. East and West Berliners celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen. A year later, Germany was reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia, and a violent one in Romania brought an end to communist authority in the Eastern Bloc. The anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people freedom to demonstrate. Now they demonstrated for an end to communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in Soviet history, elections were held in which non-party candidates could run. Boris Yeltsin led a growing democratic movement and got himself elected president of Russia the largest Soviet republic. He began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the Soviet Union itself. Communist hardliners briefly kidnapped Gorbachev and tried to set up an emergency government, but Yeltsin and his supporters gathered in Moscow and resisted. The coup failed. Yeltsin then used his newfound power to make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and establish the Russian Federation. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. Decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics. The Cold War was over.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next video.